In this video, we will be using the Fantasy Grounds Classic 5th edition rule set, and we're going to take a look at the NPC record types and the encounter record types. So we'll be covering everything from copying an NPC record to make your own personal tweaks to them, to creating completely new NPCs, and how to create and place encounters for ease of use. So starting off, we open up our NPC records window here, and we have a listing of the NPCs that are currently contained within the campaign. If we want to make a copy, let's say we have we've loaded up the monster manual and we want to tweak a goblin, and we have a goblin entry, but we want to give it either additional weapons or additional attacks or traits, make it different somehow from the default goblins. In order to do that, we can just take our Goblin Record and using the copying capabilities of Fantasy Grounds, just drag it and drop it, and you can see it's now created a copy. So if the original was from a loaded module, the copy you will be able to make edits to. So we can open up our copy, unlock it, and then we can proceed to take a look at the information. I'll give it a slightly different name so it's easier to differentiate. Now, taking a look at the record itself, we can see that here along the right hand side there are two tabs. The main tab is where all of really the important information about the NPC and how Fantasy Grounds understands its powers and capabilities. This is where all that's going to be located. So we have fields up here for size, type, alignment, all of the stuff you would see in a standard stat block, information about its saving throws, vulnerabilities and resistances. Then below we start listing all of their traits. We have actions, a section for reactions, legendary actions, layer actions, innate spells, and spells. So there's a wide variety of sections here, and you just need to fill out what is relevant for that NPC, which things are applicable. That's here on the main tab. On the other tab, we have, you can see here, this is an area of free text. So this is where you can put background information about the NPC. It can include links to images. I don't have that module open. But it can include links to images. It can include links to other characters or locations or whatever you would like. This is all formatted text that you can put any kind of information about that NPC that you would like. All right. So the key with NPCs is creating them in such a way that Fantasy Grounds can understand the contents of the various traits, actions, and elements here so that they can be properly understood and parsed and converted when being added to the combat tracker. So when you add an NPC to the combat tracker, here we have our combat tracker, you can see here I've added this adult black dragon. And Fantasy Grounds, in order to generate all of these capabilities, now here in the 5th edition rule set, it automatically lists traits, actions, and other things here on the combat tracker for you to make it easy for the DM. All of this is converted directly from the character sheet when it's added to the combat tracker. So we can see here the effects, for example, being immune to acid, that comes directly from the damage immunities field. All of its traits listed here, amphibious, legendary, resistance, will be listed here that you can open up and read through if you want to verify what the particulars are. In addition, Fantasy Grounds attempts to parse through the information and auto-generate the effects and attacks and other things. So for example, for its bite attack, this is what's written in the character or the NPC record. And Fantasy Grounds will go ahead and look through this and say, hey, this NPC has a +11 to hit, and that'll convert into the attack +11, which can then just be double-clicked on and rolled, and it will go ahead and use that. Same thing with things like damage. This has multiple damage types, a piercing damage plus an acid damage. We have other traits which can do things like forcing saving throws, applying conditions, and you can see all of those will be reflected here on the combat tracker. But in order to do this, in order for this process to work, there is specific wording that Fantasy Grounds is designed to look for and parse out so that it can automatically generate all of these various types of effects and attacks and abilities and such. And so in order to design your NPCs, if you're creating an NPC from scratch or trying to import something from a PDF or other source that you found, it's important to take note of the wording. So Wizards of the Coast, who produces all of the official 5th edition stuff, has a very consistent writing style for how all of these are written and how they're structured. And that's what allows Fantasy Grounds to be able to parse through it and understand it. Other third-party authors may not be as strict or may not follow the exact formatting requirements that Wizards of the Coast uses, and so theirs may not automatically be parsed. And so it's important to know the rules so that you can design your NPCs. So let's start off creating a new NPC, and then we'll take a look at some of those rules. So creating a new NPC entry, the first thing that pops up here is our blank NPC sheet. We're going to start off by giving it a name, test NPC. And we have a couple of fields here on the right. The first off is this green ID field, and this determines whether or not the NPC record is marked as ID'd for the players. So what this does is it toggles between using the name of the NPC on the combat tracker versus using the unidentified name. Now, if there's nothing here in the non-ID name, it'll use the default, which is just unidentified creature. But you can toggle this. I find that this rarely needs to be unidentified, as it's more helpful or more useful to use this feature from the encounter records. So we'll cover that once we get to the encounter records. Next up here on the right is the field where you define the token that will be used. So this is going to be the image used by this NPC when it's added to the combat tracker and to maps. So we can set our tokens. I've got a token here all ready to go. And we'll just drag and drop that token here onto that field. And now that's the image that will be used for this NPC whenever it's added anywhere. Along here on the top, we have the speech bubble. This allows you to speak as that NPC. You can see here normally when I type anything in, it says the source appears to be coming from the GM. If you click on the speech bubble here, it will now appear as if I am typing as the that particular NPC. So if you want to impersonate the NPC. All right, so now we have a series of unformatted text fields. So you can't apply formatting like bold, italics, underline, anything like that, or include links or anything else. But all of these fields are important for Fantasy Grounds to understand. So we're going to go ahead and convert an NPC from a stat book. Now I happen to have a stat book here that I purchased from DM's Guild. This is the Monsters Without Borders, an excellent resource. There is already a Fantasy Grounds module of this available on DM's Guild, so I highly suggest you check it out. It has a number of interesting monsters that you can add to your game. But we're going to take a look here at a stat block, and then we're going to convert some of it into Fantasy Grounds. First off, of course, we have name, we have size information, we have type, alignment, all the standard stats as we need them here. And the standard stat blocks will have, then following that, it'll be a list of traits. So we can see here there's 4 traits. And then it'll be a list of actions and a list of reactions. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this. Now, as I mentioned before, when we are converting, it is important to understand the phrasing necessary so that Fantasy Grounds can properly interpret. So let's start off putting in this arcane ooze information. So he starts off as huge, and his type is ooze, and he is unaligned. Now there is a hit points. This is or armor class initially. There is a 7. This field to the right of the armor class is if there is a specific type of armor that NPC is wearing. For example, if the NPC were wearing plate, you could write in plate. The next field here is our hit points. So there's going to be two values here. To the left is the standard default number of hit points. So in this case, 95. So within 5th edition, there are always both a standard amount of hit points and a range of hit points defined that if you want to randomly roll the hit points. And so here on the left-hand side, we put in the standard value, and on the right-hand side, we put in the dice roll. So in this case, 10d12 plus 30. So this is the dice roll for how many hit points this creature will have. Next up, we define the speed, 20 feet. And then we put in the stats. Now we don't need to type in the modifiers, we just type in the base stat. So 16, 5, 16, 1, 6, 1, because this is an ooze. And then we can begin typing in information on the saving throws and resistances and abilities. So with saving throws, it's always listed as a stat, the 3-letter version of the stat. So I can do strength plus 4. I mean, he'd have a bonus of 4 on strength saving throws. If there are multiple, you separate them with a comma, dex plus 2 or whatever. For skills, you're going to spell out the entire skill name. So you're going to put out things like stealth, and you'll notice there is autocomplete. So you can do a stealth plus 4 if this creature has bonus to its stealth skills. If there are any damage vulnerabilities or resistances, you can put them in here. For immunities, this has immunity to acid, cold, fire. If there are conditions that they are immune to, you can list them here. And these will be automatically transferred over. You can define senses, things like dark vision, and you usually will have the passive perception listed here, and then any languages that this NPC speaks or understands. The challenge rating and the experience points for that for this NPC. So that's defined the initial set of information. And if we go ahead and add this to the combat tracker, we'll see that it has interpreted some of those things. So we open up our actions tab and we can see it's added the effects. It's immune to acid, cold, and fire as we listed, and immune to the blind, charmed, and deafened conditions. And then it's automatically rolled some hit points here, 102, and it's ready to go. But we haven't finished adding all of the rest of them. So now that we're getting into traits and actions and reactions, now is where we need to be careful about the wording. So the important document that you're going to want to reference is this 5e effects wiki page. And the link should be located somewhere below. The 5e effects wiki, at the very bottom section, there is an automating effects on NPCs section. And this section will list all of the key wording that you need in order to set up the automation for that NPC, for that particular type of thing. So there are various kinds of wording that you can use for different weapon attacks, things like basic melee attacks, ranged attacks, and so forth. There's wording you can use to set up basic saving throws, to applying conditions in various ways, to rolling damage, ways to add or remove or affect immunities and resistances, healing, spellcasting traits, and other traits. So you want to take a look at this wiki page in order to have all of those handy. So we're going to take a look here first at traits. Now, for the purposes of this video, I have copied and pasted all of that information here into this story entry just so that I have it available to me without jumping back and forth to the web page. So here on the left-hand side, I have some basic things that I can do. All right. So when we're looking at traits, we had looked at this ooze here, and we want to add traits. So we have several traits to add here. We can start off by clicking on the Edit List button, and add a new trait. So the first trait added was the amorphous trait, and I can mostly copy and paste the text here from the PDF, and you can see here it's got some extra new lines. Normally I would do this through Notepad++ to help clean it up before I import it into directly into Fantasy Grounds. So I can set up this, and this trait is ready to go. Now note that there's nothing in here that requires interpretation. There's no additional effect or attack or damage line or condition that's being applied here. So this one will largely be ignored. It'll attempt to look for that information in here, but it's not actually going to find anything. Some of these others, however, might. So for example, corrosive form, we can take a look at, and we'll again copy and paste. And I'll join all of them together to form a single line. And so now we have a more complicated one. And in this one, we can see that there are damage strings applied or associated with this particular trait. Now you'll notice that when I highlight my mouse over them, or when I mouse over that damage string, Fantasy Grounds highlights it. That indicates to you that Fantasy Grounds has parsed that information and understood it, so that when it's added to the combat tracker, it will be added correctly. Now this isn't going to be the case for every single thing, but for the vast majority of things, you can tell that it's been parsed correctly when you mouse over it and it highlights it. You can also double click it and you can see it all. It will roll that particular entry. Here's the damage roll that I just did. So we can go ahead and add a variety of different traits here. Typically things like spellcasting will always be listed there as traits. So let's go ahead and add spellcasting, because there's some special rules when it comes to spellcasting. So when it comes to spellcasting trait, you want the trait name to be either spellcasting, as it's listed here, or innate spellcasting. Either one is fine. The section that the spells get placed will depend on whether you put in the spellcasting or innate spellcasting as the trait name. So let's do spellcasting. And with the spellcasting trait, there is a series of information that you're going to include. So we'll go ahead and copy, paste this over. This is just the text. We'll paste this in, remove these new lines. So first up, we'll just fill this in with the name of our NPC, a level, say he's a 3rd level spellcaster. Its spellcasting ability is, let's see, let's make this charisma, because he has a charisma of 1, because he's an ooze. And then the test NPC has the following spells prepared. So you can see here we've filled out some of the information here for this. And then we have a listing of spells. Each spell is on its, each level of spells is on its own line. You also include in parentheses the number of slots that are needed for that spell level. So, you know, cantrips are at will, and everything else will have, you know, some number of slots depending on how that NPC is defined. And at this point, we list all of the spells that are currently in this NPC's spell list. So if we take a look at our spells and we select a few, we'll filter this down to some cantrips, and it makes sense for this ooze to have, say, Acid Splash, and we'll give him one more cantrip here. We'll give him Light. Notice that it's separated by a comma. And then at 1st level, we will, let's see what 1st level spells. At 1st level, we're going to give him Alarm and Command. Why not? All right, so we have a listing of spells here that we've given. Now, you'll notice that I am not adding the spells down here to the spells area. You can drag and drop spells, but generally the preferred way to add spells is to add them here in the spellcasting trait. So for example, I can directly drag and drop the spells such as Charm Person, and I can add it, and it'll drop and add it to this section. But the preferred way is to do it here in the, let me delete this, do it here in the trait. Now once this has been completed, and as long as everything's spelled correctly, then when we close this NPC record and reopen it, Fantasy Grounds will attempt to parse this spellcasting trait and automatically add those spells to this spells area. Now, this does require that you have the source book for those spells loaded. So for example, if they're Player's Handbook spells, then you have to have the Player's Handbook loaded so that it can reference the spell records. So for example, I've got the SRD open, so I should have all of these spells available. If I close this test NPC, and I come back and I reopen my test NPC and scroll down, you can see here under spells now, it has all of the spells that I had previously defined. So it's got all of this here now available for me with that information. Now when this is added to the combat tracker, and we go here to our actions, you can see all of those spells are now listed as well as the spell slots for at level 1, which we had defined in the thing. If you find you're having issues, it's really important to double check the spelling and spacing of the spells to make sure that they're being added appropriately, and that you have the module loaded. If you do not have the module loaded and you attempt to add something, you'll get an error here and it'll say it can't find the spell, and it won't automatically add it. Another thing to note with the spell casting is if you found you made a mistake and you actually need to add an additional spell. Let's say we have one more first level spell here that's not included. If I just add it here, for example, if I add Charm Person, and I close and reopen my NPC record, it will not automatically add Charm Person. Charm Person won't be here on the list. And the reason for that is Fantasy Grounds will not attempt to reparse it if you already have spells defined. So in this case, if you need to make an edit like that, your options are either to drag and drop the spell directly or to delete all of the spells that are currently on the list. And then when that list is empty, if you close and reopen it, then it will go ahead and reparse that, re-add them, and include the Charm Person spell in this case. Now for innate spell casting, we're going to follow a similar structure. We'll add a new trait, and you can have both spellcasting and innate spellcasting. So we add innate spellcasting, and then we're going to just follow the similar type of phrasing structure. You'll notice that rather than having slots or levels associated here with spellcasting, instead we'll have a number per day. So we'll have, you can do like 3 per day or 1 per day each, and then list the spells. At will just means you have access as much as you would like. It is important to include the ability. This is necessary for setting things like saving throws to spells and stuff automatically. So it's important to make sure that you list the ability both in the spellcasting and innate spellcasting features. So let's go ahead and just copy this, and this will largely follow along the same lines. Remove these extra lines, and we'll change some names. Test NPC spellcasting ability is Charisma again, because he has a charisma of 1, and I find that funny. And we'll give this one some additional spells. Now these are going to be, we'll use some different spells so they show up different as innate spells. So at will, it's going to have Sacred Flame, all lowercase. And again, these are not restricted by level, so I can have an at will of something else at a completely different level. Cone of Cold. and then some number 2 per day each, and we'll give it a couple other spells here. Fireball, and we'll say levitate. And again, if there are any spells listed in the innate spellcasting here, this innate spellcasting spells section, if there's anything listed there, it will not attempt to automatically import. And you can drag and drop. But by closing and reopening it, it's now imported. Oh, I have to delete everything from the spells as well. All right, so everything has been removed from spells and innate spells. Close and reopen. And now my innate spells are listed. And all my spells are listed. When I add them to the combat tracker, again, let me delete this. Add them to the combat tracker and go to the actions section. You can see here the innate spells are all added and coded correctly with saving throws and stuff. And all of the spells are also added and coded correctly. All right, so let's take a look now. We've looked at some of the traits. Let's take a look now at actions. And this is again where we're going to want to be careful about the wording. We can have a variety of different actions, reactions, and so forth. Let's say this thing has, what kind of action? This has a pseudopod. Pseudopod as its action. And let's make a basic attack here. So this is going to be a melee attack. So we'll type in melee weapon attack. +5 to hit, reach 5 feet, 1 target. On a hit, it does 6, 1d6 plus 3 bludgeoning damage. Now you notice here I'm copying exactly what's written here. And I'm phrasing it using the appropriate colons and periods and stuff in the correct locations. And you can see Fantasy Grounds has already started to parse this, even though I've got an uppercase E there. It's also parsed this damage string out. But in this case, we're not done, because what we have here is a situation with multiple damage types. So we'll do bludgeoning damage plus 18 4d8 acid damage. Now, it is important in Fantasy Grounds that you have a type associated with your damage. This is so that it can be applied appropriately. Notice that when I roll, it automatically includes both when I use this, this plus in between the two different damage types. If there are any other descriptive parts of it, you can include them here. But as I said, the parsing of it depends on specific wording. So melee attacks, you use this format. Ranged attacks, if there is a two-handed option. One thing you'll notice with the two-handed option is what you're essentially doing is the first part of it is just a standard, the same as a melee weapon attack. But what we're going to do is use this OR to separate out the single-handed version versus the two-handed version. So we've got the hit such and such damage, or hit such and such damage if used with two hands. Now when we do it this way, it'll give us two options for damage roll, and we can select which one is appropriate depending on the situation. We have a similar thing here when we're dealing with melee or ranged weapon attacks. These can be different because they may use different stats. Your melee weapon may use your strength, and your ranged may use your dexterity. So it's important to set it up properly. Now, what you'll essentially do is the first section you'll set up as your melee attack, and this hit will be defined as your melee attack hit. And then you'll use the OR ranged weapon attack. Again, this is to designate it as now ranged, and you'll include the appropriate plus range information and hit damage for that. So if there may be differences depending on the stats of the creatures. All All right. So some additional things. Some powers or abilities may have force or require saving throws. So if you want the enemy to make a saving throw, you can include things like the target must make a DC and then a number ability saving throw. This is one where a lot of the third-party publishers run into issues because they'll say make a dexterity save DC 10. And because it's worded that way, if you copy and paste it, it will not interpret that properly. It has to be a DC 10 dexterity saving throw. And then Fantasy Grounds will go ahead and interpret that and force that when you make them when you roll it. So again, double check, make sure that it's highlighting appropriately. Another thing with saving throws is often they'll have taking half damage on a failed save, and that is done by adding that. You put in the DC whatever ability saving throw, taking whatever the damage is on a failed save, and then include this phrasing here. Include the phrasing or half as much damage on a successful one. And this will mean that it automatically calculates those half damage if they succeed on their saving throw. Similarly, you can have it save only against part of the damage. So if it does piercing and psychic damage, you can have the saving throw only apply on the psychic damage by including the wording here. Fantasy Grounds can also interpret various conditions. Now, these are all of the standard conditions that 5th edition has. You can see here on the effects window. All the Fantasy Grounds or the 5th edition conditions that Fantasy Grounds understands, and these can be applied simply by using the phrase "the target is" and then a condition. So if I add another one and I say the target is blinded, Fantasy Grounds will go ahead and understand that, and when I double click it or when I run it, it will go ahead and apply the blinded condition to my target. So things like prone, the target is knocked prone. There may be a few little tweaks there. Save versus condition. This is if they need to make a saving throw or the condition is applied. If there's multiple conditions, you can just join them with and if there's a duration associated with it, things like is knocked prone or is unconscious until and then a certain number of time, again, you just follow the various options available to you. Damage is done. Basically, there is a standard value and a dice roll. This is the same as we saw up there with the hit points, where there's a standard value and a dice roll value depending on how you have your options set. The extra damage one is different. This is how you would apply things like sneak attack damage. When you have a phrase that says the NPC does an extra blank amount of damage, this will add this value to whatever their normal damage roll is. So it will add that particular amount. So your rogue may do an additional 4d6 piercing damage to their normal 1d6 dagger attack. Ongoing damage can be applied as well. This will apply damage at the start of each of the turns, as well as if you have creatures that have the improved critical, meaning they have the ability to roll criticals on a 19 or 20. All you need to have is a trait with the name improved critical. You don't have to have anything else in the body of it. It's all in the name in this case. And usually there's some kind of a description element, but all it requires is the trait name. Same thing with superior critical. This adds a threatened critical range of 18 to 22. Most of the immunities and resistances are going to be defined up here in this upper section of the NPC record. But there are a few additional things that can be added as traits. Things like magic weapons, meaning that the attacks from this creature will go ahead and bypass resistances or immunities to certain types of resistances or immunities to damage from magical weapons or from non-magical weapons. There's any number of creatures in 5th edition that take either half damage or no damage when hit with a non-magical weapon. So having the magic weapons trait allows you to bypass that. There are other additional ones that you can add for damage types to affect damage resistances, and things that's you'll often see things like bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing from non-magical weapons that aren't silvered. So this phrasing allows you to affect things like a lycanthrope, a werewolf that takes damage when an attack is silvered or magical. This other types, this includes attacks that aren't adamantine. That's typically for constructs, golems, and such. There's a variety of the standard 5th edition damage types, and Fantasy Grounds also adds the following: magic, adamantine, silvered, and cold forged. Cold forged actually isn't defined anywhere in 5th edition, but it is included in Fantasy Grounds as an option. Next up, we have a section on how to add basic healing features. So if your creature has the ability to heal others, you can say either or itself. You can say the creature regains NDN hit points, or the creature regains a specific number. NDN if it's a dice roll, X if it's just a single number. This can also be applied to someone else, to another NPC, just by dragging and dropping that onto the other NPC's record in the combat tracker. If you just double click it, it will apply to the NPC that has that trait. There's also the regeneration. If you have a trait regeneration, it will set up the NPC and it looks for a number in that trait. So it says the creature regains some number of hit points at the start of its turn if it has at least 1 hit point. So creatures like trolls and stuff, which are known to regenerate, this is how you would set them up. So that they can have that. Now, all of the, of course, the monster manual ones will come with that predefined for you. But if you have something new, you'll want to word it this way. Now, Fantasy Grounds is smart enough that it can handle things like, again, trolls that regenerate, but there are specific restrictions on that regeneration. If it takes fire or acid damage, then it will not regenerate. So in this case, we have regeneration with prevention or with multiple prevention. You notice that it has the additional phrase here: if the creature takes fire or acid damage, this trait doesn't function at the start of the creature's next turn. So if at any point a troll takes fire damage in Fantasy Grounds, on its next turn it will not automatically regenerate. And again, if it has the phrase here, the creature's name dies only if it starts its turn with 0 hit points and doesn't regenerate. This is to apply to creatures that even if it drops to 0, doesn't die, it will come back to life at the start of its next turn, as long as it has this feature. We talked about spell casting. There are a few other traits that can be added that are specific, just again, mostly by name. Magic resistance. So some, especially demonic or angelic type creatures, I believe, have a magic resistance trait. This is to give them automatically having save versus spells with advantage. This is just a trait. Again, it's just based on the name of the trait. It doesn't really need to interpret the content text. We talked about magic weapons. This means that the attacks done by a creature automatically add the magic tag so that it bypasses resistance to non-magic weapons. Recharge. This is for all of those creatures that have a ability that recharges on every turn. And so in the trait name, let's add a new trait. Well, in the trait name, we're going to include this recharge. So if we have trait something, and this recharges on a 5, standard in 5th edition is to roll a d6, and on a certain number, it will recharge. You just include the phrase recharge and then the number, something here. And this means that this trait will now recharge, or it'll roll to recharge every time that it gets initiative. And last up is Gnome Cunning. This provides advantage on certain specific types of saving throws against magic. So those are all of the different types of interpreted things that Fantasy Grounds will understand when you're generating an NPC. So now that we've created this thing, we can go ahead and add it to the combat tracker. And we'll see that it's added our immunities, it's added our new threatened crit range, It's got all of our abilities here. This R5 here stands for the recharge 5, so it means roll a 5 or above in order to see whether this has been recharged. Corrosive form, this is that damage from the corrosive form trait that we had, as well as all of our spells and actions that have been created for us automatically. All right, so that is our NPC record. Very good. So now let's dive into our encounter record. We've got our full NPC all filled out. So let's take a look at our encounter record. An encounter record is a very handy grouping of some NPCs that are going to be used in a single encounter. So we'll give this a name, encounter 1. And we add NPCs to our encounter very simply by dragging and dropping our NPCs over. So we can drag our goblin over. Let's say we have a adult black dragon in this one, and a skeleton. So we've got a variety of NPCs here. Now, once the NPCs have been added to our combat or to our encounter record, then we can go ahead and tweak the numbers. So first off, we can add a few goblins. We're going to add 6 goblins and 3 skeletons. So now we've got some additional creatures here for our combat. Once we've got all of our numbers correct, we can hit this little circle button to refresh, and that'll tell us how difficult this encounter is. It calculates the CR based on the NPCs that are currently added. Now, it's important to note that these records are actually links to the NPC record. These are not copies. So if you were to open one and had the ability to edit it, if this was one that you had created, if you make an edit to this one, it will edit the original NPC record. These are just links to the records, not unique entries, not copies of the records. All right, so a couple of features here on the encounter record now that we've added our NPCs over. Here along the left-hand side, we have the tokens that will be used. Now, these are the default tokens associated with the NPC record, but we don't have to use those tokens. This adult black dragon token is kind of boring. It's just an A. I can go ahead, and if I have a cool token that I want to use instead, I can go ahead and replace that just by dragging and dropping it. Now, in this case, it does not affect the NPC record. This is just going to affect this encounter record. But I can swap it out, and you notice that it changed the image down here as well. And we'll get to this these images here in just a second. But here along the left-hand side, you can select the tokens that are going to be used when this is added to the combat tracker and when it's added to a map. Now, next up, we have our name. Now, again, this is only associated with the encounter record. This is not editing the actual NPC record's name. But if I don't want to use the term adult black dragon, let's say this is I'm using a stat block of an adult black dragon, but this one happens to be a named dragon. This is Blaxis, the Undying. And I can give him a name however I would like. And this will, again, be reflected in the combat tracker once it's added to the combat tracker, and then to all of the records that are the combat tracker and the map will all show this name as appropriate. Now, before I mentioned on the NPC record that there was this green ID that you could toggle on or off. Generally, the NPC record itself doesn't have a need to be toggled because you can set it up here in the encounter. So I can say this is unidentified, and that doesn't affect the NPC record. It's just how this particular encounter will play out. Next up, we have the faction. This is normally left to the default. By default, every creature that's added will be added as hostile when added to the combat tracker. So whenever I add this to the combat tracker, they'll be listed as red or hostile. But let's say these goblins are actually neutral to the combat encounter. I can click on this and cycle through friendly, neutral, or hostile if I want to preset it. Faction just means set it to the default. In this case, let's make these goblins neutral so that when they're added to the combat tracker, they'll be yellow. And the skeletons, let's say these belong to a necromancer in the party, so they're actually friendly, so they're going to be added as green. So I now have all of my NPCs set up and linked up here. Now I want to place them onto the map. So let me pull up a little battle map. And I've got a battle map here. I've got my grid all set. This is all ready to go. Now I can begin placing my NPCs. Now when you're placing your NPCs, you're going to drag these token symbols down here. By pre-placing them, I can make this easy on myself when I'm getting ready to run the encounter. So I'll just drag each of them to where they should be on the map when we're ready to begin the encounter. So we'll put the goblins there, and we'll say the skeletons are blocking off the way here. You'll notice as I placed each one, they were checked off, and this lets me know that they are placed onto the map. Now obviously, this encounter record, I don't want the map to show all of these placements until I'm ready to actually run the encounter. So after you have placed everything, go ahead and close the encounter record. Once you close it, all of them will be removed. When I reopen it, I can see everything has been placed. The map is empty, and I'm ready to use this for combat or any encounter. So now I've pulled up my combat tracker. When I'm ready to use it, by clicking on this Add Encounter to Combat Tracker button, it'll add everything here into their location here on the map and to the combat tracker. So now you can see everything has been added. It's automatically rolled hit points and initiative values for everybody because I have those options set. The friendly ones, you'll notice, appear as visible because within Fantasy Grounds, everything that's friendly is visible, and everything that's neutral and hostile will initially start off hidden, and you can choose to reveal them if you wish. In this case, the unidentified creature was because the encounter record was marked as unidentified, of course. I can identify it at any point by clicking on that as well, and now it'll be identified as Blaxus the Undying. Again, none of this has changed the NPC records. That still says Adult Black Dragon. It's just because of the encounter record changes, tweaks that I made, that it's now set up this way. Right. So that is our basic encounter record. There is one other, I'm going to delete these here. One other thing I want to mention when it comes to encounter records, and that is the random encounter capability. So similar to how we set up the encounter, up here on the top left we have this random button. Now clicking on that, it opens up a new window, a random encounter window, and we can go ahead and create a new random encounter. Now the difference between a random encounter and a normal encounter is that we can use dice rolls to randomly generate the encounter. So let's add again our skeletons and goblins. We'll just do those two today. And you'll notice here that there's now, instead of a number field, there is a dice string. So I can include things like 1d6 or 2d12 or whatever I would like. Now all of the other features are the same. I've got the token, I've got the ID, and the faction that I can set. But I cannot set the placement, and that's because we don't know how many there are going to be. So you will not be able to set placement on a random encounter, but you can go ahead and set a number. Now, there's another special feature here in random encounters that you can use that depends on the party sheet. So you can see here in the party sheet, I have 4 characters listed. There is a special variable that you can use here in the random encounter section that will use that number. So you can scale your encounter based on the number of players in the party sheet. Notice I'm specifying the party sheet, not the number of PC characters that are created. It only is counting those in the party sheet. And to use that special variable, you're going to use the $PC, and that will now refer to the number of characters in the party sheet. Now both of these can use basic math. I can do things like +4, I can use things like multiplication or division. multiply number of PCs times 2. So in this case, there's now 4 PCs times 2. There should be 8 skeletons when we go ahead and generate this encounter record. So, and 1d6 plus 4 goblins. So now we've got this added up, and you can use subtract and multiply, or subtract and divide. Be aware though that can produce odd results, and so you'll just have to make the tweaks them yourself. For example, if you had a fractional number, you ended up with a 5 divided by 2, and you ended up with 2.5 goblins or something like that. You would just round it down to 2. Fantasy Grounds won't put half a goblin or anything like that. As well as you can end up with a result of 0 if you have 1d2 minus 2 or something like that. You can end up with a result of 0. But once we've created all of them, we've got this record here. Then when we're ready to use it, we just go ahead and click Generate. And that will generate the encounter record for us. And at this point, I can choose to place them, or I can just add them to my combat tracker. You can see they've all been added. And if I want to quickly add them all to my map, because they weren't pre-placed, I can grab all of the hostile creatures at once by grabbing the little helmet here at the bottom. And they've now all been added to my map. I can make them visible, and I have access to all of my NPCs that are on my combat tracker. If they were set to neutral, I could drag them all using this neutral helmet, or if they were friendly, I could grab them all using the friendly helmet. That's just a little shortcut. All right. So that covers all of the capabilities for generating encounters. In a follow-on video, I will be going over how you can use the tables record type to also generate random encounters, but that will come in a later video. Thank you.